The whole of this crazy society is based on money. Ironically, money that has never, does not, and will never exist. It's just figures on a screen. When you go into a bank, you say borrow $50,000. What does the bank do? It doesn't print any more money. It doesn't move any precious metal anywhere. It just types into your account $50,000, which it has pulled out of fresh air. And then you start paying the bank interest on the $50,000. So the whole money system is like, you know, in those cartoons where there's a chase going on and all the cartoon characters are chasing each other, and eventually they run over the edge of a cliff, and they don't realize they've run over the edge of the cliff, so they keep running straight ahead on fresh air. And then someone looks down, realizes they're on fresh air, and bang, down it comes.
Money is created in an amazing way. Since there is no backing to money anymore, there used to be gold or silver behind money. In those days, money was created when there was a certain amount of gold or silver that was brought into the bank and put into the vault. Then the paper money was issued as more or less like a receipt. Say, we got your gold or your silver in the vault, here's your receipt. It's got a little, it looks like this, and it's got all kinds of decorations around the side. It says you got $10 or $20 worth of gold or silver. It's a receipt. That was how money was created, and then you could bring the receipt back at any time and get your gold or silver swapped back out. That's the beginning of the process. Well, it didn't stay that way very long in history, because the bankers discovered that while they're sitting on all this gold and silver and people are circulating these receipts, that very seldom did all of the receipts come back, or even very many of them. People were very content to let the gold and silver sit there and just use the receipts. So the temptation was so great that they began to issue more receipts than there was gold or silver.
So what you would do is you take your gold down to the blacksmith who had a safe, and he would give you a certificate saying, yes, you have a pound of gold in my safe here, and he would guard your gold, but he'd give you a certificate. Well, when you went to buy a round of drinks for your friends at Harry's bar, you wouldn't use gold, you'd use the certificates to pay off, you know, the drinks. And then those certificates could be redeemed at the blacksmith's place. Well, the blacksmiths started seeing that nobody came back to redeem their gold. They just kept circulating this paper. And that became, you know, the way that people carried on. Well, pretty soon the blacksmith figured out, well, you know, if they're not coming back for their certificates, I could probably print up a few certificates and nobody'd know the difference.
And that was the beginning of fractional reserve banking, as they call it, in which the money supply begins to expand. And it's artificially expanding because of a decision made by the bankers and later on by the politicians who went into partnership with the bankers that this was an acceptable practice. Of course, the danger with that is that if all of the, or even a substantial number of the depositors did want to take their receipts back to the bank and demand their gold or silver in return, there wouldn't be enough to keep the obligation. And so there'd be a run on the bank, and the banks would have to close their doors, and in some cases they'd actually go out of business. They'd be bankrupt, and people would lose their deposits. The bankers themselves very seldom lost very much. They might have gone to work for another bank or opened up a new bank down the street, but the depositors often lost a lot of money in this fashion, and that was the reason for going into partnership with the governments, because the governments would then say, well, the law says that the banks can do that legally, so there's no prosecution. You can't prosecute these bankers anymore because they didn't violate the law. Because of their partnership with the government, the law made it legal to do exactly what they are doing, which is one of the reasons that cartels like to go into partnership with the government. The Federal Reserve is a strange creature. There's nothing quite like it out there. Most people think that it is a government agency and that it's here to protect the best interests of the common man. But the truth of the matter is, when you cut through all of the debate and all of the research, you come to the startling realization that the Federal Reserve System is a cartel. It's a cartel, no different really than a sugar cartel or an oil cartel or a bean cartel, happens to be a banking cartel. And that means that it is private. It means that the big banks of the United States came together in 1913, and they convinced Congress to pass a law that we call the Federal Reserve Act. And this law became the embodiment of the cartel agreement. You see, what cartels do generally is they decide that they don't want to compete with each other. Cartels are made up of different separate companies which on the surface appear to be competitors. And they decide they don't want to compete with each other. They want to improve their profit margins and solidify their position in the marketplace. And so they want to get rid of competition, and they decide they're going to fix prices or divide up product or geography or something like that. And they come to cartel agreements to reduce competition between themselves. One of the problems with cartels is that it's very difficult to enforce those rules and regulations, those agreements. How do you do it? If a member of the cartel wishes to drop out and say, I don't want to play anymore, there's nothing that the other members can do, unless they have made that cartel agreement into law. Now, if they've taken the cartel agreement and they've passed it through the legislature of the nation, now it becomes law, and now when one of the members tries to drop out, they can call the government into play and use the police force of the nation to enforce the cartel agreement, which is why all cartels love to have government involved as a partner. And that is exactly what happened in the banking industry in the United States back in 1913. The Federal Reserve Act is nothing more or less than the laws, or the rules and the regulations, the cartel agreement of the banking fraternity. It's how they decided they would reduce or eliminate competition between themselves, and they brought the federal government into it, the Congress, to pass that in the form of law. So, what we're dealing with here is not a government agency at all. Now, it has some of the trappings of political appearance because the president appoints the directors to the board of directors and so forth, the board of the Federal Reserve System. But the fact is, Congress or the president has no control whatsoever over what the Federal Reserve System does. It's completely independent. So, the question arises, is this good or bad for the American people? We have a cartel which has been given the power to create the nation's money, incredibly as that may sound, as credible as that may sound, to create the nation's money, which is something that even Congress is not allowed to do based on debt. The Constitution of the United States says that Congress shall create money only when it's backed by coins, when it's backed by something like gold or silver, has intrinsic value. The Congress cannot create money based on debt, according to the Constitution, fiat money. Congress actually gave that power, which it did not have, to this cartel, the banking cartel, which we call the Federal Reserve System. It's an amazing power. And so the private banks of America have a monopolistic power to create the nation's money, and they create it out of nothing. There's no gold or silver backing behind it at all. And it's completely up to them as to how much they want to create, when they want to do it, and so forth. They can expand or contract the money supply. Now, supposedly they do this in the best interests of the American people. I mean, when the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board is called to testify before Congress, and he gives his little speech. He says, well, we had to raise interest rates today, or we had to lower interest rates today, whatever the case may be. He doesn't say we did this because it was in the best interests of our banks. He always says, well, we did this for you folks. We did this for the American people. We did this because we were concerned about the economy heating up, or we're concerned about the economy lagging behind. And we don't want people to be unemployed. We don't want inflation to be too high. It's always for the American people. But the truth is, it's a cartel. And all cartels act with the primary instinct of preserving their own best interests first. So is this in the best interests of the United States and of the American people? It is not, because that means that the money supply, which is the lifeblood of everything we do, is totally controlled by a relatively small group of people who we don't even know their names in most cases. And they are using this power to the benefit of the banking system, not to the benefit of the United States. Well, here's how it works. Remember, I said before that the Federal Reserve really is a partnership between government and the banks. So when you have a partnership, there has to be a reason, an advantage to both parties to become a partner. So to understand how this works, let's start with the government side of this partnership. The government needs money. Politicians need money. They need more and more and more money for whatever purpose. But they don't like to raise taxes. They need more money, but they want to lower taxes because that's politically expedient. If they raised the taxes to pay for all of the government projects, why, there'd be such an uproar among the taxpayers that these guys would be voted out of office at the next election. So they don't do that. They increase expenses, and they try and keep taxes low or lower than normal. How do they do that? Well, they borrow it. That's like anybody else would do. If you want to spend more than you take in, you can borrow. You can steal it, of course, which I think is another good analogy. But in this case, let's just stick with the part of borrowing it. So the government goes on record and says, we want to borrow money from the public. And so they offer these government bonds or certificates of some kind or another, treasury notes and bills, depending on their maturity dates. And they offer to pay back that money within a certain period of time, plus interest. So now they have this more money that they needed. The trouble with that, of course, is that after the period of time elapses, they've got to pay it back. Well, lo and behold, when it comes time to pay it back, the politicians are still spending more than they're taking in taxes, and so they don't have it to pay it back. Not to worry, they'll just borrow some more. So they go through a cycle. Well, this time we'll borrow enough to cover the old loans plus the interest and plus a little bit more to expand our government operations. And this goes around and around and around, and we have this thing called the rising national debt. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger because the politicians are never expecting to pay back those original debts. And in fact, they never will. And you'll see how that works in a moment. They know they never will. The money system will just fall apart before they ever have to face that problem, and that'll be, you know, their children and their grandchildren having to deal with that one. Well, no, so far so good. So they borrow this money, and the debt goes up and up and up. But there's, so far, there's no new money created because the money they have borrowed was money that was already in existence. Let's say that I wanted to buy a government bond, so I loan money to the government. No new money is created. They just got some of the original money back in the form of a loan. Where the new money comes into play is at a next step. You see, they never have enough. They never can borrow enough from the general population or from investment firms or from banks or from other countries. There's never enough money out there to borrow. They need more. And so this is where the Federal Reserve comes in. There's usually a margin, anywhere from 7 to 20 to 30% of what they need to borrow that just doesn't exist. Or in order for them to borrow it, they would have to raise the interest rates to attract that much more money in, and they don't want to raise the interest rates. So now they finally go to their partner, the Federal Reserve System. And they say, okay, partner, here's where you come into the game. We need to borrow today, let's just say another $1 billion. And the Federal Reserve officer says, okay, that's fine. Figuratively, he pulls out the desk drawer, pulls out this big black book, checkbook, course, this is all done by computers in reality, but for the sake of analogy here, it's a little easier to visualize with a checkbook. So he writes a check for $1 billion to the United States government and hands it to the Treasury official. He says, "Thank you very much." He goes down and deposits this $1 billion check into the government's checking account. Okay, so now they have another $1 billion loan, supposedly. The question is, where did that money come from? What account did it come from? Who put the money into the Federal Reserve System for that $1 billion to be loaned? And the answer is, nobody did. There is no money. It just came out of thin air. It was manufactured just for the purpose of this loan. Now, if you and I were to do that, we'd go to jail. But the Federal Reserve can do it because the government wants them to do it, because they're the lender of last resort. It doesn't make any difference if they can borrow enough money from the private sector at the rates they want to offer. It doesn't make any difference because they know at the last minute they can always go to the Federal Reserve, and by obligation, the Federal Reserve will create that money out of thin air, just the way they used to do it on the printing presses. Except today they don't use printing presses for most of it because it's checkbook money. It's in a computer, it's digits, it's invisible. They just create it out of thin air. And now this is new money, and the money supply expands on the basis of what money was created for this loan. Now that's just the beginning of the cycle. That's really the smaller side of it. This is really peanuts compared to the next cycle that I'm going to describe. So far we've talked about why the government is in this partnership, and we can see that their primary motive is because they can have access to any amount of money that they might need at any time without any questions, at any rate of interest they choose to offer. Not a bad deal. But now let's see what happens to that money. Let's assume that the fellow who delivers the mail, the post office worker, gets a check from the post office for $1,000. And now that was newly created money through the process which I just described. It's newly created money, and the post office worker doesn't know that it didn't exist the day before anywhere in the universe. He doesn't care. It's spendable money now. So he takes this check to his private bank, commercial bank down the block, and deposits it into his private checking account. Now, finally, the money is out of the government side and goes into the private commercial banking side, and this is where the action really heats up. If I were the president of the local bank where this $1,000 had been deposited, I would have been able to stand up in front of the people there in the bank and say, "Attention, everyone, this gentleman just deposited $1,000 into our venerable bank." And everybody would be happy because generally people go to the banks to borrow money. A lot of them do. And so they know that if there's money on deposit and there's lots of money to lend, generally that means that the rates of interest are low. So people are happy to know that we have money to lend. You might ask me, well, how much money do you have to loan? And I'd say, well, how much do you need? And you would say, well, I was looking at a used car, $9,000 would be about right. And I'd say, I can do that. But you would say, I thought he just deposited $1,000. I would say, yes, he did. And this could go back and forth, and you'd say, well, how can you loan $9,000 when he only deposited $1,000? And if I were a good banker, I would say, don't worry about it, sir. It's all quite legal. It's all regulated by the Federal Reserve System. It's entirely possible, and indeed it is, because according to the Federal Reserve regulations, which, don't forget, are created by the banks for the banks, all the banks have to have, at the current time, is 10% of their deposits in reserve compared to the amount of loans that they put out. 10% in reserve. So if you take $1,000 and you put that in your accounting ledger under the heading, and you put the word on the top that says reserve, now you've got $1,000 in reserve, and that's 10% of $10,000, which means you can loan $9,000 and still have 10% reserve. So now the banks can literally create $9,000 out of thin air and still be quite legal because they've got 10% in reserve. Now, that's kind of an oversimplified way of explaining it, but basically that's the accounting that goes on. So the banks will be able to, I would, as a banker, would be able to create $9,000 out of nothing and loan it to you at interest. Now, just think about that for a minute. When the government gets money created out of nothing by the Federal Reserve, it uses it for its purposes. It spends it on its programs. But when the banks create that 9,000 for every 1,000 out of thin air, the banks don't use it for their purposes. They don't build their buildings with it and pay their employees with it. They loan it to us. They loan it to institutions. They loan it to anybody that wants to pay the interest rate on it. And so the borrowers use it for their purposes, but the banks collect interest on it. And that is an amazing thing when you ponder it, that the banks can collect interest literally on nothing. So when the banks say we're going to earn 3% or 3.5% on the money we have on deposit, they're not telling you the whole story, because that money on deposit is used to leverage the creation of 9 times more money. So whatever that interest rate is, you can multiply easily by 9, and that's closer to the real effective interest rate that the banks are making. Or if you wanted to be more authentic, you would say, since this money didn't exist, in fact, there is no money, they're collecting interest on nothing, then the interest rate really is infinity. So it's not a bad business to be in, you might say, which is why, of course, the banks are doing pretty well. And so you're able to create, for every $1 billion that's created out of nothing in order to loan to the federal government, now the commercial banks are in a position to create an additional $9 billion and push that into the economy, also created out of nothing, but push that into the economy in the form of private loans. This is how money is created, not only in America, but now in most of the world, which follows this general pattern. Actions have consequences. This creation of money and expansion of the money supply has a consequence. And not only can the supply expand, but it can also contract. And so we have this boom-bust cycle, which would be very difficult if money were based on gold or silver, because the supply could not expand or contract rapidly or at the whim of some committee or some political group or some motive like that. It depends on how much gold and silver there is. In the days when money was backed by gold and silver, the supply of money remained very stable. It expanded perfectly in proportion to the expansion of the population and an expansion to the economy. So there were no booms and busts in those short periods of time when government didn't allow banks to create money out of nothing.
I think the classic example is in the 1920s, you could have taken a $20 bill or a $20 gold piece, because at that point they had a 1-ounce gold coin which they used as currency, and it was the same value as a $20 bill. And you could go out and buy a complete suit of clothes, a 3-piece suit, tie, the whole works, for either one, a $20 bill or a $20 gold piece. Today you can still do the same thing, assuming that it's a modest suit and not an Armani or a Canali or an Italian vintage, but you can spend $800–900 on a good suit of clothes, and your $20 bill has maintained its value, or your $20 gold piece has maintained its value. It'll still buy it. Your $20 bill may take you to the movies, popcorn, gummy bears, the whole ball of wax. So it takes more dollars today to buy the same things. That's the consequence of inflation.
As I said, there are consequences, and the consequence generally we see it not only as booms and busts, but as inflation. Right now we're going through a tremendous inflationary period, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future, probably to the extinction of the value of money entirely. Because as that money supply expands, and it expands at a rate faster than the rate of goods and services are expanding, that means that the dollar becomes more and more worthless. And I think the best way to illustrate that is to realize that if we had lived in ancient Rome and we had a 1-ounce gold coin of the realm at that time, that would have purchased for us a very fine toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. Today, thousands of years later, if we have a 1-ounce gold coin with no particular numismatic value, no collector's value, just the value of the gold, we can take that to the bank, exchange it for Federal Reserve notes, run down before it loses value, run down to the clothing store, and buy a nice suit, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. The value of 1 ounce of gold, in terms of purchasing power, has not changed drastically in thousands of years and never can. And the money supply should be based on that kind of a solid principle so that you can depend on its purchasing power. But when you've broken loose from a backing in the monetary system, and now you have just politicians and bankers deciding how much money is going to be created, now you've got this expansion, you've got the devaluation of the purchasing power of the dollar, and you have this thing called inflation, which means that your savings are being wiped out. The truth of the matter is the average man today, he can work a whole lifetime, and he can put his savings into a savings account in terms of dollars, and when he gets to the end of his career, those dollars will be withered and withered and withered and practically zero. So inflation is a tax. It's a hidden tax, but it's a very real tax, and it's perhaps the most dangerous of all the taxes. That is the heritage of the Federal Reserve System.
The only thing that has kept the United States economy going in the 21st century is the expansion of debt. It's all based on a buildup in consumer and government debt. The main way they kept it going was they gave credit cards to everybody. And if you maxed out this one, you started on another one. Even more important, Alan Greenspan, in order to cover up the job loss from offshoring, put interest rates down to an enormous low and created a housing boom, because what's important to people is not the price of the house, it's the monthly mortgage. And when you get rates as low as Greenspan had them, the monthly payments drop. When monthly payments drop, housing prices tend to go up. And so people who already had a house saw big rises, and they refinanced the house and took out the money and spent it. And so we've had an economy moving along in the 21st century because people are running up credit card bills, and because they were refinancing rising house prices and spending the equity they had in their homes. Now, what's happened? The housing boom is over. There's a bust. Associated with that bust, we have these very curious financial instruments, these subprime loans that were packaged and sold as derivatives, and now they are tending to bring down the entire banking system. And what are financial institutions holding these subprime derivative, these securitized packages? What they're doing to maintain their balance sheet is to sell off their good assets, their stocks in good companies, their bonds that aren't in trouble. And so that's pushed the stock market down, do you see? So the balance sheets of the banks are impaired. No one knows where this is going to end. We've had dire predictions. I don't know where it's going to end either. But these huge amounts of these subprime derivatives and securitized loans that people hold. There's no market for them. No one knows how bad the hit is. And so now the Fed wants to ease money and put more money into the system, but the banks are impaired. Do the banks, who they're going to lend to? They're going to lend to consumers who can't hold on to their homes from their mortgages, whose credit cards are maxed out. Do you see what I'm saying?
Throughout history, no nation has ever abandoned a solid monetary system. No nation has ever taken on fiat currency, which is the currency without solid backing, without having its economy destroyed. There are no exceptions. And I see nothing that gives the United States a free ticket. I don't see any reason that the United States should be exempt from this law of history. It seems to me that we have gotten by pretty well, even though we have followed terrible economic practices. We have delayed the day of reckoning, primarily because the United States dollar was the international exchange dollar. It was the dollar of settlements. And everybody wanted it. No matter how much we produced, it seemed like there was an endless demand for it around the world because they always knew somebody else would take it. So there was a lot of psychological element involved there. That era is coming to an end. In fact, I think it has already come to an end, where nations around the world eagerly want the United States dollar. They realize that we are debauching the dollar so quickly now, we are inflating it so quickly, that it's no longer a desirable currency to have. And so they're looking for alternate currencies. It could be the euro, it could be the yen, it could be anything, but they don't want the U.S. dollar because they know if they hold that dollar very long, they're going to be losing value.
The power of the United States rests mainly on the fact that the United States dollar is the world reserve currency. It's been that way since the Second World War. What does it mean to be the world reserve currency? It means that you're the world money and that you can pay your bills in your own currency. If you're running trade deficits, for example, in order to pay your bills, you don't have to sell enough of your goods, export enough to earn the money to pay the other countries for their goods and their money. You just pay it in your money. It also means there's a great demand for your money because it is the reserve of all the foreign central banks. The foreign central banks keep their reserves in your currency. This means there's a huge market for your currency. It means that markets for your assets denominated in dollars, is vast. This means you become the world financial center because any instruments, any investment instrument issued in dollars is liquid. It's marketable anywhere. So these are enormous advantages. They're the advantages that Britain once had. When you lose that advantage, you lose a lot. Now, the United States is in the process of losing that advantage. It's losing it because over time, since World War II, other nations have rebuilt, and we're no longer the only country that can make things. And so you have trade pressures. We also have a new development, and that is offshoring. What many American corporations have learned is they can increase their profits by discharging their American workforce and having their products that they sell in the United States made abroad, in China, for example, or India, where there are vast, underutilized supplies of labor. And there's pressure on companies from Wall Street to improve earnings. and the pay packages of top management are related to performance. So now that it's possible, with the collapse of world socialism around 1990, American firms have been moving more and more of their production for American markets offshore. This is doing two things to the economy. Every time an offshore good comes back in, it counts as an import, so it automatically raises imports. So every time an American firm moves a factory abroad, American gross domestic product goes down, foreign gross domestic product goes up, and the trade deficit goes up, or imports go up, which makes the trade deficit go up. So what we now see is we consume about $800 billion every year in goods, more than we produce. We've been able to do this. It's a gradual thing that we got into, a little at a time. We're able to do this because people were willing to accept the dollars as payments. It was the reserve currency. Now they have huge numbers of these dollars, and they're beginning to wonder about it. They're beginning to say we're really overweighted in our investment portfolios with dollars. And there's a less inclination. And therefore, what we've seen during the last 6 years of the Bush administration is an enormous decline in the value of the United States dollar in relation to other hard currencies, particularly the euro. When the euro was first issued, it was €1 to $1. Today, it's $1.52 that you have to pay to get €1. This is an enormous decline. Now, so what you see happening is pressure on the dollar, which eventually is going to raise prices, pressure on jobs. In the 21st century, the United States has been able to create net new jobs only in domestic services, non-tradable services. We're not creating jobs in exports. We're not creating jobs in information technology or high-tech type of service jobs. We're creating jobs with waitresses and bartenders and ambulatory health care and hospital orderlies and social service and school teachers. So that what were very strong and important ladders of upward mobility so people could rise up into the middle class and higher are being dismantled by the offshoring of middle class jobs and by the importation of foreigners on work visas. If you don't want to hire an American engineer, you claim a shortage, and then you bring in one from abroad at a much lower salary. And so we see the impact on science and engineering in the United States, research, development. These sorts of things start stagnating and slowly eroding. And in manufacturing, you lose all the supply chains that are in the process that enable you to be able to make something. This piece of the chain is moved offshore. Then this piece moves offshore. And then before long, the sort of middle-level firms who were supplying the big firms, the big firms don't want them anymore. They've offshored. So this then hits the tax base of local communities.
When you outsource manufacturing jobs to Asia, and then you insource cheap labor to drive down the price of labor for the jobs that remain, it becomes like the back of the shampoo bottle. It's like shampoo, rinse, repeat. And you really see it. The Mexican government was building a $2 billion deep-sea port in Baja Peninsula. And you really can see it there. So you outsource manufacturing to Asia. And then once the port is open on the Baja Peninsula, you import the manufactured finished goods into Baja, where you skip OSHA, you skip the Longshoremen's Union, and then you put it on NAFTA trucks and drive it into a Walmart in the middle of the country. So you see what can obviously happen on that cycle. So, and what gets washed out of that is a whole class of jobs, essentially, the business model has said that it is no longer economically viable for certain types of jobs to be done in the United States of America. Light manufacturing is clearly one of them. Maybe heavy manufacturing is one of them. It becomes a real problem in certain critical industries. For instance, we've been throwing pork barrel spending at some shipyards down in Mississippi. Trent Lott was very good at getting that money for the shipyards down there in Mobile. And we really needed to do it. This was good, healthy pork because, you know, in a time of national emergency, you can't just flip a switch and start building ships. You have to have an infrastructure, and you have to have a workforce that knows how to build ships, which means that, yeah, we'll have to waste some money building some unnecessary ships just to keep at least the seeds of an infrastructure of a shipbuilding industry in case there actually is a need for that emergency.
Offshoring is a fancy way of saying your job is in question because you can be replaced for a fraction of your cost. If you're paid $19, $20, $30 an hour, you can be replaced by someone who's willing to do the same job for $1 an hour, 25 or even 50 cents an hour, with no benefits, with no pension. And so the direction for Wall Street firms, for corporate America, is clear. If you need to solidify your profit margins, that's the first place to go, is renegotiate your labor contracts and start moving the jobs someplace else. The implications for the worker are this: you're out of a job. That's just plain and simple. You don't have a job, which means you're probably going to have to retool and re-educate because that job's not coming back. It's tough. It's easy to go from paying someone $30 an hour to 25 cents. Pretty difficult for the company to reverse that and go from 25 cents back to $30 an hour. That's not good for the bottom line at all. The jobs that are gone for good. In addition to that, we're shuttering the plants. We're shuttering the facilities that have created the nation's wealth. They're gone. We're making them go away. We don't need them. We don't need them. In a global world, as the argument would go, it's better to utilize resources where they're cheaper.
And, you know, so do we get a cheaper toaster oven at Walmart? Yeah, you get a cheaper toaster oven. But it's a hidden bargain. To me, it's a bad bargain. Because what happens to the guy that used to make the toaster oven? What happens to his family? Now the social costs of that are passed on to the community that no longer has a factory, that now, like, you know, when Maytag used to make their stuff in Galesburg, is it Galesburg, Illinois? Somewhere in Illinois. And they were there for 75 years, and they got tax credits to stay, and they left anyway because their workers were making $15 an hour, and they moved the factory to Mexico where they were paying people $1 an hour.
The enormous expense of all this, the red ink, it's a deficit, is financed by the Chinese and the Japanese, who use all the surplus dollars they earn from their trade surpluses of the United States to buy U.S. government bonds. Now, when it reaches the point, as it appears to be doing, that the Chinese feel that they don't really want any more of these bonds, that they're loaded up on American assets, $1.3 trillion at the moment, and they cease to be our creditors, how do we finance the federal government? The American saving rate is about zero, so the Americans can't buy the bonds. People haven't had any, the median income of families has not gone up in the United States in a couple of decades, perhaps longer. There's no growth in the real income of anybody outside the very highest income levels. So, and they're all struggling. They're drowning in credit card debt. Many of them now can't deal with their mortgages. How are you going to raise the taxes? So if you put all that together, you can see that it's headed to a new kind of crisis. And if the United States government wakes up one day and has to deal with the fact that the dollar is no longer accepted as reserve currency, what is it going to do?
I think the end of the era is upon us. All of those dollars that they generally call euro dollars that are all around the world, what are those people going to do with them? They don't want them anymore. So they'll start looking for ways to send them back to the United States and buy things while they still can, before the value is completely gone. And so we're already beginning to see this reversal of the cash flow back into the United States. And the money is coming in tremendous quantities. So not only do we have, oh, by the way, why is it coming in? What are they doing with it? Well, they're trying to buy up our goods and services, or buy up our politicians, or buy up real estate or corporations. They're even buying up banks now, you might have noticed. They're sending this money back to the United States to buy a strong interest in some of the biggest banks of America. The banks need the money. And sometimes the pundits will say, well, look, we're getting capital back into the United States. No, they don't understand the difference between money and capital. Capital is wealth. Capital is ownership. Capital would be a stock in a corporation. Money is just pieces of paper. So what we're doing is we're losing capital, real capital, which means ownership in the productivity and the business entity of America. We're shipping the capital out and getting worthless paper dollars back in. And so that's what they're doing with this money. And so not only is the Federal Reserve expanding the money supply very rapidly to pay for all of its programs, to pay for its wars, to pay for its welfare, to pay for bailing out people whose homes are in trouble. They're just creating money like crazy to do this without raising taxes. And now we got a proposal to lower taxes while they're increasing spending. The insanity is incredible. Not only is that happening, but all this other money for the past 30, 40, 50 years that's been around the country is also coming back in. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out when all this money comes into the United States, it just gets more and more worthless. And your savings and my savings will become worthless too. The price of a loaf of bread, Lord knows what it's going to be, but it's going to be many times higher than it is now.
A depression is a period of time during which most people's standard of living drops significantly. There are other good definitions of a depression. That's a nice, broad, general one. And I believe that because there is such a thing as the business cycle, which we don't have time to go into now, but the problems that we had in the 1930s, we're going to see that type of a phenomenon again. It's not going to be like the 1930s. It's going to be different. The similarity is going to be a massive drop in the general standard of living. And I call it the Greater Depression. The U.S., especially for the last 15 years, our main export, our main product has been dollars, which are unbacked liabilities of the U.S. government. And we've been able to ship these things abroad by the trillions, and these nice foreigners ship us all kinds of good things. They ship us Mercedes and Sonys and cocaine and oil and all kinds of things, and we just give them dollars. But now there's 6 trillion of these dollars out there, and these people are starting to realize that they're holding hot potatoes. And they don't want to all run towards the exits at once, but they know what they've got. They've got just pieces of paper that are unsecured liabilities of a bankrupt government. And these dollars are going to start flowing back into the U.S. And inflation is going to explode in this country. Interest rates are going to go through the ceiling. It's going to be devastating for the average American.
What you see happen is a big reduction in real living standards for 95% of the population. The living standards will just all of a sudden be adjusted downward substantially. Now, many of these people are already hard-pressed. So what comes from that? And then you have to see, that means that the real purchasing power has shrunk, and so the real goods and services that are coming off the shelves has shrunk. That's recession. That's more unemployment. It's a dangerous situation. That's what I say. It's unprecedented. That's why I call it a calamity in the making. I don't say that it has to happen, but it's going to happen if they don't make some big changes soon. If things continue to go on, if we continue to think in all our hubris that we're the superpower and the world adjusts to us, it's going to hit the fan, because that ain't the case. That is not the case.
So what are they going to do about it? And they're going to go to their government. They're going to say, please help us. They're going to go to the same politicians, the very same politicians who got them into this mess, and ask them to solve the problem, which is a huge mistake, because these politicians already have the solution in mind. What they're planning to do is let the American, in my opinion now, is let the American dollar collapse. That way they don't have to pay back the national debt, remember? They have all this tremendous national debt in dollars and all this tremendous obligation, which they can never repay. So it's to their advantage just to let the dollar disappear and wipe that off the books and replace it with a regional currency. They already have the name for it. It'll be called the Amero. And it'll be a currency which will be jointly owned, jointly representative of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And this is part of a long-range step that they've had to merge those three countries into a regional single government. It's been going on for a long, long time, and most Americans are still in denial on that. They're still saying, oh, that would never happen. The American people would never go for that. The Canadian people would never go for that. And of course, the truth of the matter is it makes no difference what the Canadian people or what the American people want. It's what these elitists want. It's what the people want who are actually making the decisions. And I know that's a harsh statement, but that's the reality that we're facing today. So they're going to offer a new currency, and Americans generally will say, oh, that's wonderful. Now this currency will replace the old worthless currency, and there'll be new hope. The truth of the matter is the new currency will be no different than the old currency, except it'll be a fresh start. Everybody will be given a new equal number or relatively equal number, depending on how many old Federal Reserve notes they can trade in and that sort of thing. But it'll also be a fiat currency. There'll be no gold or backing behind it. And it, too, will be run by the banks and the politicians. And then the final step beyond that is to merge the Amero with the euro, and they'll be developing a similar currency for Asia and Africa and South America. Get all of those, then finally, and we're talking about maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the line, merged into a single global currency. Now at that point, there'll be no place else to go. Today, if your currency is losing its value, you can go on the internet or go to your brokerage house and you can swap currencies. You can say, gee, I don't like what's happening to the American dollar. I think that the German mark is doing a lot better, or the Swiss franc. And you can get out of the currency that's falling on its face. Finally, when you get to these regional and to these international, finally to the international currency, there'll be no place else to go, so you'll be locked in. That's not a very pretty picture. In other words, what I'm saying is that these people who have formed this partnership between the banks and the governments of the world are planning on controlling our economic lives and our personal lives as well. And this is not just a question of money. It's not just a question of, are you going to be secure in your retirement? This is not just a question of how much you can buy with your paycheck. This is a question of personal liberty, personal independence, and national sovereignty. The problems we're facing today are much bigger than just money. But if you follow the money trail, you can see where it's all going.
To get the Amero, they have to first destroy the dollar, which is what the Trilateral Commission in the 70s said with Zbigniew Brzezinski and David Rockefeller. They stated, first the euro will rise by 2000, it will defeat the dollar will go down, then we will create the Amero, claim that it's competing with that, then we'll have fluctuations there, and we'll finally peg it at a global mark with a new global reserve currency that we issue and we control, pegged to oil. And that's why they got to control the oil, because whoever has the world reserve currency, people have to accept that for the buying of oil, which is energy. And that's the connection of the fiat currency to reality.
I spoke years ago at a conference, an economic conference, about the world economic system. And this guy came up to me afterwards, and he was someone who got his money, playing the Las Vegas casino, known as the Wall Street and the commodity markets and all that stuff. And he wasn't very convinced. Anyway, I met him 3 months, 4 months later, and he said, my goodness me, he said, I can see what you're saying. He said, what I've noticed is every time Alan Greenspan, then head of the Federal Reserve, was about to make a statement, 2 or 3 days before, the major players in the stock markets, commodity markets, etc., got into something and out of other things. And every time, the effect of Greenspan's statement has been to push up what they got into and push down what they got out of. Why? Because they wrote his statement. The whole economic system is about whether people have confidence in it, and the confidence comes from the people who run it. And so what we're going to see, and we've started to see this with Greenspan, is we're going to see more and more negative statements about the economy, and we're going to see a breaking of confidence in it, and therefore we're going to see its demise, its collapse. Now, this won't collapse catastrophically for the elite, because people say to me, well, why would these elite people, why would they crash the stock market when they had lots of money in it? Well, if you know a stock market is going to crash or a commodity is going to crash because you're the one who's going to crash it, then what do? You get out of it just before the crash, you let it crash, and then you buy up vastly greater amounts of that at a few cents on the dollar, and then you increase the confidence and up it goes again, and now you own vast amounts more than you did before. There was the famous infamous story of the Rothschilds at the time of the Battle of Waterloo, when the Rothschilds put out the false rumor in the London financial district that Britain had lost the Battle of Waterloo. And, of course, everything crashed. And then came along the real news, the real truth, which is they'd won the Battle of Waterloo and the stock market went flying up again, except when it crashed, the Rothschilds had agents all around buying up stocks on a few cents on the dollar. And at the end of that day, the Rothschilds were vastly more wealthy and powerful than they were before. So if a stock market crashes or an economic system crashes, it's because those who move trillions of dollars around it every day have made it crash. And in a world where money is king, where money decides choice, where money decides life possibility, what greater way of creating chaos and fear than a collapse of the economy? And we're already seeing that happen. It works like this. This is how the economic system has worked for centuries and still being applied today. It's real simple, and this is how the elite few have trawled the wealth of the world and created booms and busts at will. Stage one, they push interest rates down, start recognizing the cycle that's just coming to an end, and they put lots of money into circulation, what we call money, because it's not governments that put money into circulation. It's private banks controlled by the same pyramid, making loans to people, credit loans. That's how money's put into circulation, not by governments. So what the banking cartel does is it puts vast amounts of money into circulation by pushing interest rates down and giving loans for, on next to no collateral. What happens then is there's lots of economic activity because there's lots of money swirling around, so there's lots of units of exchange to buy goods. So what happens is people get more confident, they take out more debt themselves, because, we can have a bigger house now, darling. The economy's doing so well, we'll have a bigger car, we'll have 2 holidays, vacations a year now, or 3 maybe, because we're doing ever so well. And what do businesses do? They get into more debt, because crikey, we've got all this demand, we've got to invest in plant and machinery and more staff and all this, so we can meet demand. And then that is in effect the elite, economically, putting the fishing line out. And then at some point, and we're closing in on that point now, they start reeling the fishing line in. Because what they do is they start pushing interest rates up. Now what happens is lots of money that was circulating here, buying things and creating economic activity, is now going out of the economy to pay increased interest rates on the debts that people have. As a result of that, there's fewer things being bought and sold. Companies don't need as many people working for them. They're now stuck with all this debt and all this plant and machinery that they had that they don't need anymore. People can no longer pay their mortgages, so now there's a problem with the mortgage companies, and they have a problem because they've got to lose their home. And as more and more people do that, the value of homes goes down until eventually there's a point where they're worth less than you actually paid for them. And what we're seeing then is a bust being manipulated. And it's happening for one reason and one reason only. The amount of units of exchange in circulation is being removed from the economy. What we're seeing now are the signs that they're now manipulating a bust in this very way to create as much chaos and panic and fear as possible, because panic, fear, and chaos are a manipulator's dream.